The calm, turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea now sit under the shadow of a gathering storm. As of today, September 27, 2025, an imposing American military force has assembled just beyond the horizon of Venezuela. This is not a routine patrol or a simple training exercise. The scale of this deployment is unlike anything seen in the Western Hemisphere for decades, drawing unsettling parallels to the lead-up to the 1989 invasion of Panama. Warships slice through the waves, advanced fighter jets patrol the skies, and thousands of U.S. Marines stand ready aboard a formidable amphibious assault ship. The message, whether intended or not, is one of overwhelming power and readiness for action. The flotilla is a clear display of modern American naval might. It includes at least 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers and a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, vessels armed with a formidable arsenal of Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of striking targets deep within Venezuelan territory. Lurking beneath the surface, a nuclear-powered attack submarine adds a silent, unseen layer of threat. These ships represent a concentration of firepower that far exceeds what would typically be required for standard maritime law enforcement. The sheer number of sailors and the advanced hardware they command signal that the United States is prepared for a significant confrontation, turning this region into a potential flashpoint for international conflict. Supporting the naval presence is a powerful air and ground contingent. The USS Iwo Jima, an amphibious assault ship that acts as a mobile military base, carries over 2,500 U.S. Marines from the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. This vessel is equipped with Harrier attack jets for air support, MV-22 Osprey helicopters for rapidly inserting troops, and heavy-lift helicopters for logistics. It can also deploy hovercraft and amphibious vehicles for a potential beach landing. To complete the picture, at least 10 of the latest F-35 fighter jets have been stationed at airfields in nearby Puerto Rico, placing them well within striking distance of key Venezuelan targets. The situation has escalated rapidly, creating a tense standoff that has captured the world's attention. On one side, you have the government of Nicolas Maduro in Caracas, defiant and accusing the U.S. of imperialist aggression. On the other, you have the Trump administration in Washington, which insists its actions are necessary for regional security. The Venezuelan military has responded with its own posturing, flying its fighter jets close to the American warships in a dangerous game of chicken. Every movement, every statement, and every new piece of hardware that arrives in the region ratchets up the tension, pushing both nations closer to a precipice from which it may be difficult to step back. Officially, the White House has given a clear reason for this massive military buildup. It is part of an enhanced counter-narcotics operation. The Trump administration states that its primary goal is to disrupt and dismantle the vast drug trafficking networks that use the Caribbean as a highway to move cocaine and other illicit substances into the United States. According to this narrative, Venezuela, under the leadership of Nicolas Maduro, has become a narco-state, a country whose very government institutions are complicit in the drug trade. The deployment, therefore, is framed as a necessary law enforcement action on a grand scale, aimed at protecting American citizens from the scourge of drugs. The administration has specifically pointed to powerful cartels, including the notorious Tren de Aragua, as the targets. In July 2025, President Trump reportedly signed a secret directive authorizing the use of military force against Latin American cartels that have been designated as terrorist organizations. This legal reclassification is crucial, as it shifts the rules of engagement from a police action to a military one. The official justification is that these groups are no longer just criminals, they are narco-terrorists who pose a direct threat to U.S. national security. This provides the legal and political cover for deploying warships and fighter jets instead of just Coast Guard cutters. To bolster this claim, Washington has accused Maduro and his top officials of personally running a drug cartel known as the Cartel of the Suns, or Cartel de los Sol. The name refers to the sun insignias worn by high-ranking Venezuelan military generals. The U.S. alleges that this cartel uses the nation's ports, military, and financial systems to facilitate the shipment of cocaine. By designating this alleged cartel a terrorist organization, the administration has effectively labeled the Venezuelan head of state a narco-terrorist. This forms the central pillar of the public argument, or casus belli, for the intense military pressure now being applied to his government. However, many seasoned military analysts and regional experts are questioning this official narrative. They point out that a counter-narcotics mission, even a large one, does not typically require missile cruisers, amphibious assault ships, and thousands of Marines. Such operations are usually the domain of the Coast Guard and the Drug Enforcement Administration, using smaller, faster vessels and surveillance aircraft. The sheer size and offensive capability of the deployed force seem wildly disproportionate to the stated goal of stopping drug boats. This discrepancy has fueled widespread speculation that the war on drugs may be a convenient cover story for a much more ambitious objective. While Washington talks about drugs, many observers in Latin America and beyond hear the drums of war. The growing suspicion is that the true unstated goal of the massive military deployment is not to stop cocaine shipments, but to force a change of government in Venezuela. This is the regime change theory, that the United States is positioning its military to either directly topple President Nicolas Maduro, or to create the conditions for his government to collapse from within. The scale of the force, with its amphibious assault capabilities and overwhelming air power, seems tailor-made for an operation aimed at decapitating a foreign government, not just intercepting smugglers at sea. This theory gained significant traction after a series of provocative actions by the United States. In August 2025, the State Department doubled the bounty on Nicolas Maduro's head to an unprecedented $50 million, more than was ever offered for figures like Osama bin Laden or Saddam Hussein. Similar multi-million-dollar bounties were placed on his top aides, bringing the total to $100 million for just 4 individuals. Such enormous sums are not typically offered for drug traffickers. They are tools used to destabilize a government by encouraging betrayal from within. The message seemed clear: Washington wants these men gone, one way or another. The situation escalated dramatically on September 2, 2025, with a lethal drone strike in international waters. A boat carrying 11 Venezuelans was obliterated by a missile, with all aboard killed instantly. The U.S. claimed the vessel was carrying drugs and that its occupants were members of the Tren de Aragua cartel. However, this marked a shocking departure from standard procedure. Normally, suspected drug boats are interdicted by the Coast Guard, the crew arrested, and the vessel seized. The use of a military drone to execute suspects at sea without trial looked less like law enforcement and more like a targeted assassination, a tactic of war. This series of events paints a picture that aligns more closely with a regime change strategy than a drug interdiction campaign. President Trump has historically shown a preference for limited military interventions, such as airstrikes and special operations, over large-scale ground invasions. The current deployment seems perfectly suited for such a scenario, mirroring the NATO intervention in Libya in 2011. The strategy may not be a full-blown invasion, but rather to use gunboat diplomacy and the threat of surgical strikes to encourage a military coup or an internal rebellion against Maduro, with the U.S. fleet standing by to provide critical air and naval support. The roots of today's crisis run deep, tangled in a history defined by oil, ideology, and mutual distrust between the United States and Venezuela. For much of the 20th century, relations were stable, based on Venezuela being a reliable oil supplier to the U.S. Everything changed in 1999 with the election of Hugo Chavez, a charismatic socialist who launched what he called the Bolivarian Revolution. He used Venezuela's immense oil wealth to fund social programs, but also moved to consolidate power and challenge U.S. influence in Latin America. He nationalized key industries, including seizing assets from American oil giants like ExxonMobil and Chevron, setting the stage for decades of animosity. After Chavez's death from cancer in 2013, his hand-picked successor, Nicolas Maduro, took the helm. Maduro inherited a country dangerously dependent on oil, and his timing could not have been worse. In 2014, global oil prices collapsed, gutting the source of nearly all of Venezuela's income. This, combined with years of corruption, mismanagement, and the decay of the nationalized oil industry, sent the economy into a catastrophic freefall. Between 2014 and 2021, the Venezuelan economy shrank by an astonishing 75%, one of the worst economic collapses in modern history outside of a major war, triggering a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. The first Trump administration responded to Maduro's growing authoritarianism with a policy of maximum pressure. After the widely disputed 2018 presidential election, the U.S. and dozens of other countries refused to recognize Maduro as the legitimate president. Instead, they recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido as the interim leader. Washington severed diplomatic ties and imposed crippling sanctions on Venezuela's state-owned oil company and financial system. The goal was to starve the Maduro regime of cash and force its collapse. While the sanctions failed to oust Maduro, they deepened the economic misery and accelerated the migration crisis, sending millions of desperate Venezuelans across the region, including to the US southern border. This history of escalating pressure forms the backdrop for the current military buildup. Each action and reaction has pushed the two countries further apart. The US sees a corrupt, illegitimate dictatorship that destabilizes the region, while Venezuela sees an imperialist power intent on stealing its oil and crushing its sovereignty. The sanctions, the political standoff, and the economic collapse have created a cycle of perpetual crisis. This long and bitter history helps explain why simple diplomatic solutions have failed, and why in 2025, military options appear to be back on the table as a potential, albeit dangerous, final resort. So, to understand why the United States is applying such immense pressure, one must understand who Nicolas Maduro is and, why Washington considers his removal a top priority. Unlike his charismatic predecessor, Hugo Chavez, Maduro was actually a former bus driver and union leader who rose through the ranks of the Socialist Party, mostly due to his unwavering loyalty. When he came to power in 2013, many observers questioned whether he really had the political skill or popular support to lead the country. He lacked Chavez's powerful connection with the masses and pretty soon faced a spiraling economic crisis that would have tested even the most capable leader. As Venezuela's economy crumbled, Maduro's grip on power became, increasingly authoritarian. He systematically dismantled democratic institutions just to maintain control. He stacked the Supreme Court with loyalists, created a parallel legislature called the National Constituent Assembly to sideline the opposition-controlled National Assembly, and used security forces to violently suppress dissent. Widespread protests against food shortages, hyperinflation, and failing public services were met with tear gas, rubber bullets, and mass arrests. Human rights organizations have documented thousands of cases of extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, and torture under his rule, painting a grim picture of a leader willing to do anything to stay in power. From Washington's perspective, Maduro represents a multifaceted threat to US interests. First and foremost is the accusation of narco-terrorism. The US Department of Justice has indicted him and his inner circle for allegedly leading the so-called Cartel of the Suns, turning Venezuela into a hub for cocaine trafficking to the US and Europe. Second, his government is seen as a source of regional instability. The economic and humanitarian crisis he has overseen has caused nearly 8 million Venezuelans to flee their country, creating a massive migration crisis that has strained resources in neighboring countries like Colombia and Peru, and has become a major political issue at the US border. Finally, and perhaps most critically, Maduro has welcomed America's biggest geopolitical rivals into its own backyard. He has forged close alliances with Russia, China, and Iran, granting them a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. These alliances go way beyond simple diplomatic ties. They involve weapons sales, economic support, and technological cooperation. For the US, the presence of a hostile, anti-American government in control of the world's largest oil reserves and actively collaborating with its adversaries is just an intolerable strategic risk. This combination of drug trafficking, regional destabilization, and hostile foreign alliances is why, at the end of the day, Washington wants him out. The crisis reached a new boiling point following the Venezuelan presidential election in July 2024. After years of economic collapse and political turmoil, the vote was seen by many as a last chance for a peaceful democratic solution. The Biden administration had previously eased some oil sanctions in exchange for Maduro's promise to allow a free and fair election. The unified opposition rallied behind a widely respected former diplomat, Edmundo Gonzalez, who drew massive crowds and generated a powerful wave of hope for change across the country. On election day, turnout was enormous as Venezuelans stood in line for hours to cast their ballots. But when the polls closed, the situation quickly descended into chaos. Exit polls and independent observers overwhelmingly indicated a landslide victory for the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez. As hours turned into a day with no official results, the opposition declared victory based on their own tallies. In response, Nicolas Maduro also claimed victory, but his government refused to release the official vote counts, citing technical issues and alleged sabotage. It was a move that the international community immediately saw as a blatant attempt to steal the election and cling to power against the will of the people. The reaction from the international community was swift and decisive. The United States, the European Union, and the vast majority of Latin American nations refused to recognize Maduro's claim. They issued statements recognizing Edmundo González as the legitimate winner and demanded that the democratic will of the Venezuelan people be respected. Spontaneous protests erupted across Venezuela, but Maduro's security forces launched a brutal crackdown. Reports emerged of over 2,000 arrests and dozens of deaths as police and paramilitary groups clashed with demonstrators. Fearing for his life, President-elect González was forced to flee the country and seek exile in Spain. This stolen election was the final straw for many in Washington. It proved that a diplomatic path with the Maduro regime was no longer viable. The crackdown and the exile of the rightfully elected leader demonstrated that Maduro would never willingly give up power, regardless of international pressure or the desires of his own people. This event directly led to the maximum pressure policy being re-energized and escalated under the second Trump administration. The blatant disregard for democracy closed the door on negotiations and opened the door to more coercive measures, setting the stage for the military confrontation we see unfolding today. A major factor driving the U.S. sense of urgency is Venezuela's growing alliance with a trio of America's most powerful adversaries: Russia, China, and Iran. As Maduro became increasingly isolated from the West, he turned to these nations for economic, military, and political support. This has transformed the Venezuelan crisis from a regional issue into a global geopolitical chess match. For the United States, the idea of these rival powers establishing a significant and permanent foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a region long considered America's sphere of influence, is a strategic nightmare that policymakers are determined to prevent. Russia has become Venezuela's most important military partner. Moscow has sold Caracas billions of dollars worth of advanced weaponry, including Sukhoi fighter jets, attack helicopters, and sophisticated anti-aircraft missile systems. These weapons are intended to deter a potential U.S. military intervention. Furthermore, Russia has announced plans to build an ammunition factory in Venezuela and has sent military advisors to train Venezuelan troops. There have even been rumors, though unconfirmed, that Moscow is considering deploying hypersonic missiles on Venezuelan soil, a move that would pose a direct and severe threat to the U.S. mainland. While Russia provides military muscle, China provides the economic lifeline that keeps Maduro's government afloat. As U.S. sanctions choked off Venezuela's ability to sell oil on Western markets, China stepped in to become the primary buyer of its crude exports. This trade is often opaque, involving complex debt for oil swaps, but it provides the Maduro regime with the hard currency it needs to pay the military and maintain a basic level of state function. Beijing's support is less ideological and more pragmatic. It secures a vital source of energy and expands its economic influence in a region traditionally dominated by the United States. Iran's collaboration with Venezuela is perhaps the most alarming for U.S. military planners. The two countries have deepened their partnership in defense technology, particularly in the realm of unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. In 2024, Venezuela unveiled a new kamikaze drone, the Zamora 5-1, which appears to be a locally produced version of Iran's infamous Shahed 136 drone, the same model used with devastating effect by Russia in Ukraine. The prospect of an anti-American regime just a few hours' flight from Florida possessing fleets of these attack drones raises serious security concerns, with potential threats to everything from U.S. cities to the critical shipping lanes of the Panama Canal. With warships on the horizon and tensions at a fever pitch, the world holds its breath and asks, what happens next? There appear to be three main possibilities, each with profound consequences. The first and most explosive scenario is direct U.S. military action. While the deployed force is likely insufficient for a full-scale ground invasion and occupation of a country the size of Texas and California combined, it is perfectly equipped for a range of more limited options. This could include a naval blockade to enforce sanctions, surgical airstrikes against military targets, or special operations raids to capture or kill high-value individuals like Maduro. The goal of such a limited strike would likely be to kick the door in and trigger a second scenario, an internal rebellion or coup. The United States may be betting that a decisive show of force could shatter the confidence of the Venezuelan military and encourage factions within the armed forces to turn against Maduro. The massive bounties on the heads of Maduro and his top lieutenants are designed to sow division and incentivize betrayal. In this scenario, the US would provide air and naval support to Venezuelan forces on the ground who rise up to restore the government of the elected winner, Edmundo Gonzalez, mirroring the NATO-backed rebellion that overthrew Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. The third possibility is a peaceful, negotiated resolution, though this currently seems the most remote. The intense military pressure could be a form of high-stakes diplomacy, designed to force Maduro back to the negotiating table from a position of weakness. The objective might be to compel him to accept a deal where he and his inner circle are granted safe passage into exile in a friendly country, like Cuba or Russia, in exchange for handing over power to a transitional government. However, after the stolen election of 2024, there is very little trust left. Maduro may believe that any deal is a trap, and the US may believe he will never honor any agreement. For now, the situation remains a dangerous standoff. A miscalculation by either side could lead to a rapid escalation. A Venezuelan fighter jet flying too close to a US warship, or another drone strike that kills the wrong people, could be the spark that ignites a wider conflict. The Trump administration is gambling that its maximum pressure campaign will cause the regime to fracture before it has to fire a shot. But Nicolas Maduro has proven to be a survivor, and he may decide that fighting and going down as a martyr is preferable to surrender or exile, potentially drawing the United States into a messy and unpredictable conflict. The crisis unfolding off the coast of Venezuela may seem distant to many people living in the United States, but its outcome will have direct and significant consequences for all Americans. First, a major conflict could have an immediate impact on the economy. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves. While its production is currently low, a US-backed intervention aimed at restoring its oil industry could, in the long term, lead to a surge in global supply and lower gas prices at the pump. Conversely, a war that damages infrastructure or spills over into the region could disrupt shipping and cause oil prices to spike, affecting the cost of living for families across the US. Furthermore, the situation is inextricably linked to the issue of migration at the US southern border. The humanitarian crisis in Venezuela has already created one of the largest refugee crises in the world. A military conflict would undoubtedly trigger a new and even larger wave of migration, as millions more flee the violence and chaos. This would place immense strain on neighboring countries, and would certainly lead to a surge of asylum seekers arriving at the US border, intensifying an already complex and politically charged debate within the United States about immigration policy and border security. For the people of Latin America, the stakes are even higher. A US military intervention, even a limited one, would be a deeply controversial event, reviving painful memories of past US interference in the region. While many governments oppose Maduro, they are also wary of seeing the United States unilaterally impose its will through force. A conflict could destabilize the entire region, disrupt trade, and create political divisions between countries that support the intervention and those that condemn it. It would set a new precedent for how regional disputes are handled, potentially replacing diplomacy with the threat of military power. Ultimately, this is a story about democracy, stability, and security in our own hemisphere. The outcome will determine the fate of 30 million Venezuelans who have suffered for over a decade. It will test the limits of American power and influence in the 21st century, and it will answer a critical question: can a peaceful, democratic solution be found for a nation in crisis, or will the region be plunged into a conflict with unpredictable and far-reaching consequences? What happens in the Caribbean Sea over the next few days and weeks will not stay in the Caribbean. Its ripples will be felt across the Americas for years to come.